A 22-year-old rookie police officer is sitting alone in a marked patrol car after 3 in the morning. He is not chasing anybody. He is not making an arrest. His assignment is to sit outside the home of a drug case witness and make sure the people threatening that witness stay away. Then an old car appears. 4 men have come looking for a police officer. One moves toward the passenger side. Another closes in on the driver's side. The officer turns toward the distraction. David McClary raises a handgun and fires at point-blank range. 5 shots. Officer Edward R. Byrne dies in the driver's seat. The 4 men did not know him personally. They were not there to rob him. According to the federal case that followed, they had been told to kill a police officer, and the order had come from a man who was already behind bars, Howard "Pappy" Mason. Mason was supposed to be removed from the streets. Instead, prosecutors proved that orders were still leaving prison, people were still carrying them into South Jamaica, crack was still moving, and the organization Mason led was still functioning. One of those orders ended with a rookie officer dead at Inwood Street and 107th Avenue. And that single decision changed the scale of everything that came after. Edward Byrne had joined the New York City Police Department only months earlier. Before that, he had served with the Transit Police. He had turned 22 only days before his murder. At roughly 3:30 on the morning of February 26, 1988, he was working a fixed post in South Jamaica, Queens. The house behind him belonged to a Guyanese immigrant known publicly by the single name Arjun. Arjun had done something dangerous in that neighborhood. He complained. He repeatedly called police about open drug activity on his block and agreed to cooperate with authorities. Contemporary reporting said his complaints helped police arrest a local dealer. His home was then firebombed twice. Threats continued. Police responded by placing the house under round-the-clock protection. That is why Byrne was there. 1 rookie officer, 1 marked patrol car, 1 house that everyone in the neighborhood could see was being protected. The protection itself created a visible target. Trial evidence later reconstructed what happened the night before Byrne was killed. Several of the men who would participate met inside a Queens home. Witnesses testified that Todd Scott told the group that the boss wanted a police officer killed. The testimony also said the participants had been promised $8,000. That figure came through prosecution witnesses and later court records. It should be understood as part of the evidence presented against the conspirators, not as some established standard price for a police killing. According to later federal and state court records, the boss was Howard Mason. The order was retaliation. Mason had been imprisoned on a state firearms case. The Second Circuit later summarized the evidence bluntly. After his imprisonment, Mason directed Bebos members to assassinate a New York City police officer. The target did not have to be Edward Byrne. It had to be a cop. That is what made Byrne's position so vulnerable. The men carrying out the order knew there was usually an officer sitting outside Arjun's house. They did not need to search the city. The police had placed a uniform, a marked vehicle, and a predictable schedule in one location. Scott Cobb drove the car used by the group. Todd Scott approached the patrol car from the passenger side. David McClary came toward the driver's side and became the gunman. Philip Copeland was part of the planning and assault team, and later records described him as a recruiter or enforcer whose job included making sure the plan was carried out. Trial evidence placed the men around the patrol car as the shooting began. Arjun himself testified that he woke to 5 gunshots and looked outside in time to see the car and men leaving the scene. The federal appellate court later described Byrne as having been shot 5 times in the head at point-blank range. The order had moved from prison to a conversation, from the conversation to 4 men, from 4 men to a patrol car. That chain is the real beginning of the Howard Mason story. Because by the time Byrne was killed, Pappy Mason was not simply a jailed dealer with friends outside. He was the leader of an organization federal courts called the Bebos, and prison had not broken the command chain. The Second Circuit later described the Bebos as a large and violent narcotics organization operating under Mason's direction. Between February and the middle of August 1988, the court said the group distributed approximately 1 kilogram of crack every week. 1 kilogram every week. And the most important detail was that Mason was controlling the organization while incarcerated in New York State prisons. He used prison telephones. He used personal visits. Instructions moved outward. The street organization kept working. The court record shows enough detail to reconstruct how. Crack did not move from Mason's prison cell directly to customers. There were people between him and the street. Workers processed cocaine. Other members moved the finished crack to packagers. Packaged crack then went to street sellers. Money came back from those sellers. Part of it paid workers. The rest moved upward. Char T. Davis, one member later convicted in the Bebos case, was described as transporting processed crack several times each week from another member to workers who packaged it. Davis then distributed the packaged crack to street sellers and collected sales proceeds. This was not an organization that required the leader to personally touch every vial. The structure did the work for him. And Howard Mason had another crucial link outside prison: his mother, Claudia Mason. At her federal trial, prosecutors established that Claudia was not simply taking calls from an incarcerated son. She acted as a liaison between Pappy and the Bebos. According to accomplice testimony credited in the appellate record, Claudia regularly relayed instructions about narcotics activity from Howard Mason to organization members. She also monitored whether those members followed the instructions. One example involved a Bebo member named Albert Ingram. His responsibilities included delivering cocaine and money. When Claudia believed he had failed to perform those duties properly, she told another member that Ingram would be punished. Soon afterward, she ordered him to return narcotics, money, a van, and a car he had been using. When what he returned was less than expected, she demanded more drugs and more money. This was not a vague claim that Pappy still had influence. It was a working command system. A message came from prison. Claudia carried it outward. People were monitored. Cars and drugs were accounted for. Money was collected. Failure produced consequences. And federal investigators eventually captured that system on tape. A court-authorized wiretap on Claudia Mason's home telephone intercepted approximately 65 conversations used to corroborate her role. When federal agents searched her home, they found approximately 1 kilogram of crack in a bedroom, some already packaged into vials. They found a loaded handgun. They found earrings marked Bebo. Safe deposit box keys led investigators to jewelry and $19,800 in cash. That evidence matters because it shows what prison had failed to do. It had removed Howard Mason physically. It had not removed the people who could receive his instructions. It had not removed the communication channels. It had not removed the narcotics. And it had not removed the cash. South Jamaica's drug market at the time also contained another major name, Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols. Contemporary reporting often connected Nichols and Mason closely, and sometimes described Mason as Nichols' lieutenant or associate. Their cases overlapped. Their people overlapped. And the huge federal investigation that followed Byrne's death attacked both networks at the same time. But later appellate records make an important distinction. They describe the Bebos as an organization under Howard Mason's direction. So it is too simple to say that Mason merely ran one department of a single Fat Cat organization. Nichols had his own network. Mason led the Bebos. Federal investigators eventually treated the two groups as closely related enough to pursue together, but distinct enough to identify separately. That distinction is also important when talking about money. Contemporary reports describe the broader Nichols-related drug ring targeted in 1988 as doing approximately $20 million a year. That does not mean the Bebos alone made $20 million. It does not mean $20 million belonged personally to Pappy Mason. The stronger number for Mason's own organization is the one in the federal appellate record. Approximately 1 kilogram of crack per week during a 6-month period in 1988. That tells us scale without borrowing someone else's revenue. South Jamaica already had a history of drug-related violence before Byrne's murder. Nichols had been accused in the killing of his parole officer, Brian Rooney. During the conflicts around the Nichols organization, his family home was firebombed and his disabled sister was killed. Those events had drawn police attention. But much of the violence could still be understood outside the neighborhood as part of a brutal local drug war. Byrne changed that. He was not a rival dealer. He was not part of a competing crew. He had no financial dispute with Howard Mason. He was a uniformed police officer assigned to protect a civilian who had cooperated. The federal court later concluded that Mason wanted a police officer killed because he had been imprisoned. Byrne happened to be the officer the Bebos found. The killing was intended to send a message about control. But the first immediate result was a police response on a scale the neighborhood had not seen before. Officers flooded South Jamaica. A hotline was established. Calls poured in. The reward for information grew. Within days, police began identifying the men involved. Todd Scott and Scott Cobb were arrested first. The other suspects followed. Within about a week, all 4 men accused of carrying out the killing were in custody. The arrests produced something even more important: statements. Scott and Cobb gave videotaped accounts to police. Their versions implicated themselves and one another enough that prosecutors later used 2 juries at the same trial to avoid legal problems created by one defendant's statements being used against another. Cobb's recorded account included the critical allegation: the killing had been an order from Pappy. He said Mason had been furious about being jailed and wanted a police officer killed. The state case moved against the 4 men on the street. The federal investigation began moving upward. In March of 1989, 2 separate juries convicted Scott Cobb, Todd Scott, and Philip Copeland of second-degree murder and weapons charges. David McClary, identified as the shooter, was tried separately and convicted later that year. All 4 ultimately received sentences of 25 years to life. The state trials also exposed the planning. Witnesses said the group had discussed the order before the murder. Videotape statements described the car, the trip, and the roles of the participants. A jury no longer had to decide whether Byrne's killing was random. The prosecution presented it as an organized assassination. But the four men were not the end of the chain. Edward Mason was already in prison. That made the federal question different. Could prosecutors prove that the man behind bars had directed the men who actually drove to Inwood Street? The answer would require more than the murder scene. It would require the drug organization itself. And by then, federal investigators were listening to its communications. Byrne's death created pressure far beyond Queens. More than 10,000 police officers attended his funeral on Long Island. They stood several rows deep along blocks leading to the church. Officers came from outside New York. President Ronald Reagan called the Byrne family. Mayor Edward Koch publicly attacked the federal response to narcotics trafficking and even bought a newspaper advertisement demanding stronger action. During the presidential campaign, Edward Byrne's father gave his son's police shield to George H.W. Bush. Bush carried the shield and displayed it while arguing for tougher national drug and crime policies. A murder on one South Jamaica corner had entered presidential politics. The police response also changed on the street. New York expanded aggressive narcotics enforcement in drug-heavy neighborhoods. Tactical narcotics teams began saturating areas where street dealing had become entrenched. Arjun eventually entered witness protection. Police used his house as a small substation, partly as a symbolic statement that cooperation would not be abandoned after Byrne's death. That was exactly the issue the murder had challenged. If a witness could be threatened, his house firebombed, and then the officer guarding him assassinated, why would the next resident call police? The city had to answer that question in public. The investigation answered it differently. It followed the organizations. On August 11, 1988, nearly 6 months after Byrne's murder, roughly 400 federal agents and police officers moved in a coordinated 3-state operation. The raids reached New York, Alabama, and Virginia. 30 people were arrested. Among them were relatives and associates tied to the Nichols and Mason organizations. 5 buildings in Queens were seized. Agents reported recovering loaded machine guns, shotguns, cash, cocaine, and heroin. Nichols and Mason were both arrested on federal narcotics conspiracy charges while already sitting in state prisons. That detail captured the problem perfectly. The men at the top were already incarcerated. Federal authorities were now arresting them again because prosecutors believed the organizations beneath them were still active. The $20 million annual figure that appeared in contemporary coverage referred to the broader drug ring targeted in the operation. The sweep was not simply a raid on the Bebos. It was an attack on interconnected South Jamaica networks, including the organization around Lorenzo Nichols and the Bebos around Mason. Byrne's killing had helped push investigators toward the combined case. A later Justice Department account said the murder led to a sweeping federal investigation of the Mason and Nichols gangs, and eventually to federal convictions of 19 other members, in addition to Mason. The government was now doing what local murder prosecutions alone could not. It was connecting prison calls, street narcotics, family intermediaries, weapons, money, violence, and the people who carried orders from one part of the organization to another. The case against Claudia Mason demonstrated how useful that approach could be. The wiretap did not merely catch gossip. It showed people discussing operational problems, drug deliveries, money, members who were not following orders, vehicles that had to be returned, crack that had to be packaged and moved. The evidence gave prosecutors a way to explain how a leader in prison could continue controlling people outside without physically appearing at a crack sale. And the investigation eventually returned to the decision that had made the entire case nationally famous. Edward Byrne. On August 15, 1989, prosecutors filed a superseding federal indictment charging Howard Mason alone with, among other crimes, ordering Byrne's murder. By then, Mason's behavior in federal custody had become another problem. He had been detained at the Metropolitan Correctional Center after the August raids. Court records say disciplinary problems followed. He attacked 2 co-defendants with a homemade weapon. He started a fire in his cell after being denied access to a telephone. He was transferred to the federal facility at Otisville. There, disciplinary segregation followed again. Then, after the new charges involving Byrne were filed, questions began to emerge about whether Mason was mentally competent to stand trial. Doctors did not agree. One psychologist saw paranoid behavior and violent outbursts. Another concluded that Mason understood the charges and was deliberately refusing to cooperate. Mason himself often refused examinations. He argued with lawyers. He complained about his treatment. The court had to decide whether the behavior reflected mental illness severe enough to prevent a trial, or whether Mason understood exactly what was happening and was choosing not to participate. The trial began in November 1989. Mason was present for jury selection. Then he refused to attend parts of the proceeding. Judge Edward Byrne repeatedly told him the trial would continue whether he came into the courtroom or not. Eventually, a closed-circuit connection was arranged so Mason could watch from a holding cell. He attended some portions. He stayed away from others. The jury heard the case anyway. And the federal prosecution was broader than a simple accusation that Mason had made one phone call ordering one killing. Prosecutors presented him as the leader of the Bebos narcotics enterprise. They presented cocaine trafficking, the use of minors in drug distribution, racketeering, continuing criminal enterprise charges, and violence used to maintain that enterprise. The Byrne murder was part of that structure. After 3 days of deliberation, on December 11, 1989, the jury found Mason guilty on all counts. Contemporary reporting described convictions for racketeering, committing violence to maintain a criminal enterprise, 6 cocaine trafficking counts, operating a continuing criminal enterprise, and 2 counts involving the use of minors to distribute narcotics. Most importantly, the jury found the government's case proved Mason's role in ordering Edward Byrne's murder. That should have produced an immediate sentencing payoff. It did not. Mason's mental condition became the next battle. After trial, his behavior grew more erratic. Court records describe him refusing basic hygiene, breaking a window, and threatening a corrections officer. A psychiatrist who evaluated him in 1990 concluded that Mason was then unable to address his legal situation rationally enough to be sentenced. Other doctors disagreed about the cause. Some saw possible psychosis. Others saw antisocial behavior, deliberate resistance, or malingering. One defense psychiatrist later concluded that Mason had been incompetent even during trial. Other experts rejected that conclusion. For years, the sentencing could not be completed while Judge Corman continued reviewing competing psychiatric opinions. By 1992, another evaluation found Mason able to explain the roles of the judge, jury, and counsel, and to understand that he had been convicted of ordering Byrne's murder, even though he denied guilt. The court eventually concluded that Mason had been competent during the 1989 trial and was competent to be sentenced. On January 7, 1994, more than 4 years after the guilty verdict, Judge Corman imposed the sentence: life imprisonment. Mason appealed. He argued that the court had mishandled the competency question, that he should not have been tried while absent from parts of his trial, and that his right to be present had not been properly protected. In May 1995, the Second Circuit rejected those arguments and affirmed. The appellate opinion opened its factual summary with the same central point that had driven the federal case. Howard Mason was a leader of the Bebos. He was imprisoned on a state firearms conviction, and after imprisonment, he directed underlings to assassinate an NYPD officer. The conviction stood. So did the life sentence. Edward Byrne's name did not disappear from federal law enforcement after the trials ended. Federal criminal justice grant programs were later named in his memory, eventually including the Edward Byrne Memorial Justice Assistance Grant Program. Decades later, federal courts describing that program still summarized why his name was attached to it. A 22-year-old officer had been killed while guarding an immigrant cooperating in a drug investigation. Howard Mason had ordered the killing from prison. The case had become part of the institutional memory of American law enforcement. But the most revealing part of the story remains the original patrol car. Byrne was sitting outside Arjun's home because the state was trying to protect a witness. Arjun had complained about drug dealing. His home had been attacked. Police put an officer outside to show that cooperating did not mean being left alone. Howard Mason's order was intended to demonstrate the opposite. A witness could have police protection, and the drug organization could still strike. A leader could be in prison, and his orders could still reach the street. For a moment, that message worked exactly as intended. Edward Byrne was dead. The patrol car was still sitting outside the witness's house, and the man prosecutors proved had ordered it was already behind bars. But the killing changed the scale of the response. The 4 men who carried it out were identified and convicted. The Bebos command structure was exposed through witnesses, prison communications, and wiretaps. Hundreds of agents moved against the wider network. Mason was indicted again, this time in a federal case that connected the drug enterprise to the murder. He was convicted. Then he was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in federal prison. Howard Mason had sent an order out from behind bars. The order came back as a life sentence.